Leave it, Dawn. I'm not interested. Georgia Whitlow's heart sank as the words hit her like a slap. The door to the ranch house stood wide open, but the man standing on the threshold was not who she'd expected. She had come all this way, desperate for the opportunity her father had promised, but the man in front of her wasn't welcoming. He was angry, his eyes flashing with a mix of confusion and resentment. Dustin McCabe, the stubborn cowboy who had been promised a wife, had clearly been expecting someone else. Someone prettier. Someone more like her beautiful sister, Willow. The sudden realization hit Georgia hard. Her father had tricked him. The contract she thought would change her life had been forged. She had nowhere to go. Her father had refused to take her back, his words cold and dismissive. "You're good for working, not for wanting," he had told her just before she left. Now, she stood on the doorstep, a woman with no place to call home, no family willing to take her in. And she certainly wasn't the woman Dustin McCabe had hoped for. George's voice wavered, but she didn't back down. "Give me 1 week. That's all I ask. 1 week, and if you still don't want me, I'll leave. But please, let me stay until then." Dustin stared at her for a long, silent moment, as if considering whether to slam the door in her face or let her in. His expression softened just slightly, though the bitterness lingered. Finally, he grunted, clearly annoyed. "Fine. 7 days. That's it. But after that, you're gone." It wasn't the warm welcome she dreamed of, but it was all she had. With a quiet nod, Georgia stepped over the threshold, entering the house that smelled of dust and loneliness. The place looked nothing like she'd imagined. The furniture was worn, the floors covered in dirt and neglect. It felt empty, as if it hadn't seen a woman's touch in years. Dustin didn't offer to help her with her bags. He simply turned and walked away, his back stiff. "You can find a place to sleep in the spare room," he said over his shoulder. "I've got work to do." Georgia unpacked her single bag in the small, spare room. She could hear Dustin's boots thumping across the wooden floor outside, the rhythm of his movements as distant as his words had been. As she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, she couldn't help but let a tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, angry at herself for being weak. She wouldn't let him see her cry. Not now. But as the night grew darker, she made a silent vow to herself. 7 days. That was all she had. She would prove her worth, no matter what. She would change everything. George's father had always told her she wasn't as good as her sister Willow. She wasn't the one who would marry the wealthy merchant or be sought after by suitors. No, she was the one who did the work, the one who cleaned, who cooked, who was always overlooked. But she wasn't going to live in Willow's shadow anymore. She was going to do something that would make Dustin McCabe see her. Not for the woman he expected, but for the woman she truly was. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the old house seemed to echo her feelings. Alone, uncertain but determined, she lay down on the cot, wrapping the thin blanket around her shoulders. Sleep came slowly, but eventually her exhaustion took over. And in that darkness, George's resolve solidified. She might not have been the woman Dustin wanted, but she would be the woman he needed. She could already feel the fire of determination beginning to burn within her. The countdown had begun. She would change everything. And when a week was up, Dustin McCabe would know exactly who she was. Tomorrow, she would start. The next morning, Georgia woke before dawn, the chill of the air creeping through the cracks of the old ranch house. She wasn't sure how long she'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing through the endless uncertainties of the days ahead. Despite the discomfort of the narrow cot, she pushed herself up and began her first day of chores. The house was still as silent as the night had been, Dustin nowhere to be seen. She went to work, sweeping the dust from the corners of the floor, cleaning the windows that hadn't been touched in years. As the sun slowly rose, the house began to feel more like a home, but still, it lacked warmth, the emptiness echoing in the silence that lingered after every task. She had no idea what to expect from the man she was supposed to serve, but she had no choice but to move forward. Breakfast was a simple affair. Eggs and bread, nothing fancy. She made it with care, but Dustin didn't come to the table. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at the meal, and without a word, turned and walked out, already on his way to the barn. The coldness stung, but Georgia didn't let it show. She cleaned the kitchen, organizing the mismatched items that filled the cupboards, trying to make things as pleasant as she could in a place that felt like it hadn't been lived in for far too long. Each task, each small effort to make the house feel alive, was met with silence. By the second day, Georgia was beginning to understand the reality of her situation. She was invisible in this house. Dustin hadn't given her a single word beyond the initial cold rejection. He barely acknowledged her existence, as though she were a ghost moving through the halls. That afternoon, when she rode the wagon to the mercantile for supplies, the town's true cruelty became clear. The moment she arrived, Maeve Talcott and the local gossips cornered her, their eyes sweeping over her with a judgmental coldness. "So you're the sister," Maeve said, her voice oozing with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Everyone knows he wanted Willow, the beautiful one. He didn't get her, did he?" The women snickered, eyes narrowing as they looked her up and down. The words hit Georgia like a physical blow. She had never been the pretty one. Willow was the one everyone admired, the one with the golden hair and the smile that could light up a room. But Georgia? She had always been the one left behind, the invisible one, the one no one ever really noticed, the one no one wanted, ordered wine and got water. One of the women muttered under her breath, and the others laughed, clearly finding the comparison fitting. It was all so clear now. Her father had sent her here, knowing she had nowhere else to go. He had promised Dustin a wife, but he'd given him a replacement, a substitute. "Willow's engaged to that merchant fellow," Maeve added with a sneer. "She's too good for a man like McCabe. Too good for this place." The cruelty in their words was like daggers, each one cutting deeper into George's already fragile heart. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, refusing to let them see the hurt, but inside, a storm was building. Her father's betrayal stung more than she could have ever anticipated. She had come here hoping for something different, hoping for a chance to prove herself, but instead, she was met with humiliation. As she loaded the wagon with the supplies and rode back to the ranch, George's mind raced. There was no denying the truth of what the women had said. She wasn't beautiful like Willow. She wasn't the woman Dustin had wanted. She had been sent here as an afterthought, a poor substitute for the woman he had truly hoped to marry. But she wasn't going to let that define her. The cruel words of the town, the rejection from Dustin, it all fueled something inside her. She wasn't going to let him send her away. If he wanted her gone, he would have to throw her out. She would fight. She would use the one thing she knew she could control, her cooking. The thought came to her as she pulled the wagon back into the yard. She had grown up in the kitchen with her mother, learning the art of creating meals that could make people feel something, make them remember what it was like to truly taste something made with love. Cooking wasn't just about food, it was about connection. It was about showing the world who you were without saying a word. And if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was make food that left people speechless. As she dismounted the wagon and began unloading the supplies, George's mind was already on the next step. The food she would cook would be her weapon. Dustin McCabe might not have wanted her, but if there was one thing she could do, it was make him notice her. The thought brought a spark of hope she hadn't felt since arriving. Hope was a dangerous thing, she knew, but it was the only thing she had left. As she worked in the kitchen that evening, pulling out her mother's old recipe book, she felt something shift inside her. She was no longer the invisible woman. She wasn't just a replacement for her beautiful sister. She was Georgia Whitlow, and she was going to make her mark. Tomorrow, Dustin McCabe would see her. He would taste what she had to offer, and no matter what happened, he would know who she was. He would know that she was worth far more than he had ever given her credit for. The sun barely peered over the horizon when Georgia rose the next morning, her mind already racing with the plan she had set for the day. The ranch was still quiet, save for the distant sound of Dustin moving about outside, his heavy boots clomping across the dirt. She knew this day had to be different. She would make breakfast that would change everything, something that would make Dustin take notice of her. Not as the sister who had been sent to replace the one he wanted, but as a woman with talents and worth of her own. She worked quickly, the rhythmic motion of her hands calming her nerves as she gathered her ingredients. Her mother's recipe book sat open on the counter, the pages worn from years of use, the notes in the margins filled with love and care. Georgia had always found solace in cooking, in turning simple ingredients into something extraordinary. It was a language she knew, a way to speak without needing words. Today, she would speak loud and clear. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, the smell of fresh herbs and sizzling meat filled the house. She had prepared herb-crusted ham, golden biscuits with honey butter, and eggs cooked to perfection, their yolks bright and soft. The coffee was spiced with cinnamon, a secret technique her mother had taught her to give it a richness that lingered on the tongue. The smells filled the house, making it feel warmer, more alive, as if the kitchen itself was waking up after years of slumber. As she set the table, her hands trembled slightly, not from the work, but from the anticipation. She knew that today, for the first time, she wasn't just cooking to fill a belly. She was cooking to be seen. She was cooking to show Dustin McCabe that there was more to her than he had ever imagined. When Dustin finally walked through the door, his eyes narrowed, his expression hard. He paused just inside the doorway, sniffing the air as if unsure what he was smelling. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be capable of this. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching between them. Then, without a word, Dustin walked to the table and sat down, his movements stiff and cautious. Georgia didn't say anything either, but inside, she felt a surge of pride. This was it. This was her chance. She watched as Dustin picked up his fork, took a bite of the ham, and then paused. His eyes flickered to her, searching her face as if trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. He took another bite, then another, until the plate was nearly empty. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he finally asked, his voice rough, as though the question had been forced out of him. The words stung, but not in the way he probably intended. It wasn't a compliment. It was an acknowledgement that he hadn't expected her to be capable of such a thing. "My mother," Georgia replied simply, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "She taught me before she died." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of both their losses. Dustin didn't respond immediately, but he didn't have to. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, something that had never existed between them before. He finished the meal in quiet contemplation, pushing the empty plate away with a small grunt of approval. For the first time since her arrival, he looked at her, not with anger or frustration, but with something softer, more respectful. "That was good," he said, barely audible, as if admitting it was difficult for him. But he said it. That was all that mattered, and it was enough. As he stood to leave, he washed his plate without being asked, a small, almost imperceptible shift in his attitude. Before he walked out the door, he stopped in the doorway, his gaze lingering on her for just a moment. "Thanks," he muttered, and then he was gone, leaving Georgia standing in the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the days passed, Georgia's cooking continued to evolve, becoming more elaborate with each meal. She started making lunch, then dinner, each dish an opportunity to show Dustin what she could do. There were roasted chickens with herbs she had foraged herself, beef stews that simmered for hours, their rich aroma filling the house with warmth. She made apple pancakes for breakfast, drizzling them with real maple syrup, the sweetness of the syrup perfectly balanced by the tang of the apples. Each time Dustin came in from his morning chores, the house smelled different, and each time he stopped at the door to take a deep breath, his face betraying a fleeting moment of surprise. Slowly, he began to change. At first, he would sit at the table without a word, but soon, his questions became more personal. "How did you know to use that herb?" he asked one morning, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Where did you find those apples?" he asked another time, clearly impressed. Each answer from her was met with a little more respect, a little more warmth. And then came the moment when he stayed at the table, no longer rushing off after his meal, but sitting with her, watching her work. Sometimes he would bring in fresh water from the well without being asked, or fix something around the house that needed attention, like the wobbly table leg she had mentioned in passing. She noticed the small things, and so did he. There were moments when their hands would brush as they reached for the salt or the pepper, and both would freeze for just a second, feeling the electric charge between them. They didn't speak about it, but it was there, undeniable. It was in the way Dustin began to linger in the kitchen after meals, watching her move, his eyes softer than they had been when she first arrived. Georgia couldn't deny the shift that was happening. It wasn't just in the way Dustin looked at her. It was in herself. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to believe that maybe she was worthy of something more than just being a replacement, something more than just the invisible sister. She was beginning to believe that she could make a difference, that she could carve out a place for herself, even if it was just in this small, dusty house on the edge of nowhere. And for the first time, she found herself hoping, not just for survival, but for something more. But hope, she knew, was dangerous. It was the one thing she couldn't afford to lose. And yet, with each passing day, it grew inside her, like a seed taking root, growing stronger, more impossible to ignore. And Georgia Whitlow wasn't sure if she was ready for what hope would bring. But she couldn't help but wonder, could Dustin McKay be the one to show her that she was worth choosing? By the evening of day 5, something had shifted in the air, something unspoken but palpable. The house, which had felt so cold and distant just days ago, now held a warmth that Georgia couldn't ignore. Dinner that night was the best she'd made yet. A hearty beef roast, mashed potatoes, and homemade bread, the rich aromas filling the kitchen as she worked. She set the table with care, just as she had the last few nights, but there was a difference this time. Dustin had been coming in earlier, staying longer after meals, not rushing off to work or retreating into his silent world. When he walked in that evening, there was no grunt of disapproval, no coldness in his eyes. He simply nodded, a small gesture, but it meant more than any words could have. Georgia served him the meal with a quiet sense of pride, watching as he sat down, his gaze lingering for a moment on the food, then on her. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The tension that had once existed between them had lessened, replaced by something softer, more familiar, almost like a companionable silence that grew with every passing day. Dustin was different now, more open in small ways, even if he didn't know how to express it. He washed his own plate for the second night in a row and brought in fresh water without her asking. A small but significant act of kindness that made her heart swell in a way she hadn't expected. But it wasn't until the evening wore on, when Georgia cleared the last of the dishes and set them aside, that the true shift occurred. Dustin, who had been unusually quiet that night, lingered at the table longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the flickering light of the oil lamp. There was a heaviness in his gaze, something deeper than the surface frustration that had once defined their interactions. Georgia could feel it in the air, the change, the way the house now seemed to hum with an energy that hadn't been there before. She had expected him to get up and leave, as he usually did, but he didn't. Instead, he sat there, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "My wife used to cook," he said, his eyes distant, as if the words were a weight he hadn't meant to lift. Georgia froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't expected this. She had heard bits and pieces about his past, his wife Sarah, who had died 3 years ago, along with their daughter Mary, from a fever that had swept through the town, but she hadn't expected Dustin to bring it up, not like this. Sarah, he continued slowly, his voice thick with the memories of a life he had clearly tried to bury. She was the one who kept this place together before she died. I couldn't bring myself to fix meals. Didn't want to remember. But you've made it feel alive again. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, Georgia didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if he was talking about her cooking or about her, or if it was just the grief speaking. But she didn't pity him. She didn't see him as a man in mourning, though she knew that's what he was. She saw him as someone who had lost, who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. Without thinking, she sat down across from him, her gaze steady, not pitying but understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Dustin," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I can't imagine what it's been like. But I can tell you this, Sarah and Mary would want you to keep living, to let go of the hurt, just a little bit. They wouldn't want you to be this lost." He didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes shifted away, staring into the dim light of the lamp, as if trying to find the right words. After a long pause, he finally looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his gaze shifted. There was a softness there, something that hadn't been present when he first opened the door to her all those days ago. "You remind me of her," he said quietly, his voice thick. "Not just in the way you cook, though that's part of it, but you make this house feel like she never left, like it's still a home." The vulnerability in his voice was something she hadn't expected, and it broke through the wall she had carefully built around herself. For the first time since arriving, she felt seen, truly seen, not as a replacement or an afterthought, but as someone who had something of value to offer. She felt a lump rise in her throat, but she held it back. "Cooking is how I keep my mother alive," she said, her voice steady, though the grief that had haunted her for years threatened to break through. "Every meal, every recipe, it's like I'm keeping her voice alive. That's how I remember her." She paused, her words echoing in the space between them, and then she added, "I guess we're both just trying to hold on to the people we've lost." Dustin didn't say anything for a long time, but his eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of the man beneath the pain. He didn't pity her either. He understood. The connection between them grew in that quiet moment, something unspoken but undeniable. For the first time, they weren't just two people thrown together by circumstances. They were two people who had experienced loss, who understood the weight of it. "You've brought life back to this place, Georgia," Dustin said finally, his voice a little rougher than before. "More than the food, more than the house. You brought me back. I didn't know I needed it until now." The words hit her harder than she expected. She didn't know what to say in return, but there was no need for more words. The silence between them had shifted, becoming something different, something more intimate. For the first time, they both understood the other, not just as strangers or as a cook and her employer, but as two souls who had carried the weight of grief and loss. The wall that had stood between them for so long began to crumble. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm, but before he could say anything more, he stood abruptly and walked toward the door. "I need to go. It's been a long day," he muttered, his tone changing as quickly as it had softened. But before he left, he turned back to her. "Thank you for more than the food." His words lingered in the air long after he left, and Georgia sat there, feeling the weight of what had just transpired between them. She realized, with a mixture of fear and wonder, that she had begun to fall for him. And that terrified her, because after all the years of never being chosen, of always being the one left behind, hope was a dangerous thing. But it was also the only thing she had left. As she cleared the table, her hands shaking slightly, she knew she had reached a turning point. Tomorrow was day 6, and she wasn't sure what would happen after that. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about cooking anymore. This was about something much deeper, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. But she had no choice. She would have to. The morning of day 6 arrived with an unsettling stillness in the air. Georgia could feel it as soon as she woke, a tension that seemed to grip the house, a sense of anticipation that both excited and unnerved her. She went through the motions of a morning routine, her hands moving mechanically as she prepared breakfast, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what lay ahead. The countdown had begun, and tomorrow was the day Dustin would make his decision. The thought of it made her stomach twist, a mixture of dread and hope that she couldn't shake. She had worked so hard to prove herself, to show him that she was more than just a replacement for Willow, more than just a woman who had nowhere else to go. But now, with the end of the week approaching, she wasn't sure what would happen next. Would he send her away, as he'd promised? Or had the last few days been enough to change his mind? She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Outside, the sky darkened as the day wore on, clouds rolling in ominously. Dustin had been working harder than usual, securing the barn, checking on the animals, his movements more urgent than usual, as if he could sense the storm coming. Not just the one in the sky, but the one that was brewing between them, the one that would come to a head tomorrow. The wind picked up, and by the time the afternoon arrived, it was clear that a storm was on the way. The air felt thick, charged with electricity, and Georgia could sense the shift, as if the world was holding its breath. She had already made plans for dinner, an elaborate spread of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a stew that had been simmering all afternoon. The smells filled the house, but the atmosphere was heavy, charged with the tension of unspoken words. She couldn't ignore the fact that tomorrow would change everything. Would Dustin send her away as soon as the storm passed? Or would he surprise her, make a choice that neither of them had expected? It was impossible to say, but the uncertainty hung over her like a weight she couldn't escape. As the storm approached, the wind began to howl outside, rattling the windows, and the first rumble of thunder shook the walls of the house. Georgia had been lost in thought, her hands moving absent-mindedly as she set the table. But the sudden crash of lightning made her jump. She glanced out the window, watching as the storm broke in a flash of light and sound, the rain pouring down in sheets. She froze in a moment, her thoughts clouded by fear. The storm wasn't just outside, it was inside her too. She couldn't shake the fear that she would be left in the storm, abandoned once again. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to steady herself. But before she could gather her thoughts, the door slammed open and Dustin entered, soaked to the bone, his face grim as he wiped the rain from his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, dripping onto the floor, his eyes scanning the room as if he were looking for something. Finally, his gaze met hers, and for the first time in days, there was no hardness in his eyes, no distance. There was only something raw and vulnerable, a quiet intensity that made her heart race. "We're going to have to stay inside," he said, his voice low, almost distracted. "The storm's too dangerous. I need to make sure the animals are secure." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and Dustin turned to go, but then stopped, his expression shifting as he looked back at her. "You're afraid," he said, the words not a question, but a statement of fact. George's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the storm outside that had her on edge, though. It was the storm inside, the one that raged in her chest, the one that threatened to tear her apart with each passing minute. She had no idea how to respond to him. Not when every word she'd spoken to him over the last week had been about surviving, about proving she was worth something. How could she tell him what was really going on in her heart? The storm outside continued to rage, but it was the silence between them that felt deafening. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not the storm that scares me," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. It's what happens tomorrow, when this week is over. Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind howling outside. Dustin didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before, an understanding, a recognition that went beyond words. He stepped closer to her, his boots creaking on the floorboards as he crossed the room, and she could feel her pulse quicken. "You think I don't know what tomorrow is?" he asked, his voice so quiet that she had to strain to hear it. "You think I haven't been thinking about it?" Georgia looked up at him. The words caught her throat. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain the way her heart had been torn apart by the fear that he would send her away without a second thought. But before she could respond, Dustin crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hand reaching out to gently take hers. His touch was warm, grounding, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a wave of calm wash over her. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've noticed. I've seen everything you've done. I've seen who you are." She froze, her heart skipping a beat as his words sank in. "I'm not going to throw you out," he continued, his grip tightening around her hand as if to reassure her. "You think I'm just going to let you go because of contract?" The words were so simple, but they struck her like a thunderbolt. For the first time in days, she let herself hope. But just as quickly, the doubt returned. "Then why?" she started, her voice trembling, but she didn't know how to finish the question. "Why do I feel like I'm just waiting for you to send me away?" The question hung in the air, the storm outside raging louder as the rain pounded against the walls of the house. Dustin took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he let go of her hand and stepped back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to do this, Georgia, but I can't just let you go. Not like this." The storm outside seemed to reflect the one brewing between them, and for the first time, it felt like the walls that had stood between them were beginning to crumble. As the storm continued to howl outside, Dustin and Georgia stood in the kitchen, the space between them charged with the truth they had both been avoiding. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, it felt like they were no longer just 2 strangers thrown together by fate. They were 2 people who had finally seen each other, really seen each other, and for the first time, there was hope in the air. Hope for something more. But they both knew, deep down, that whatever came next would require facing the truth. And that truth would change everything. The dawn of day 7 broke clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the storm that had raged the night before. The air smelled fresh and clean, the world seeming to wake up with a sense of renewal. Yet, for Georgia, the clarity of the morning only made the pressure mounting inside her worse. She had spent the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a storm of their own. The week had come to an end, and she knew that this day would decide her future. The promise Dustin had made to her the night before, that he wouldn't send her away, echoed in her mind, but she was too afraid to fully believe it. Was it just words? Was he saying what she needed to hear to keep her from leaving? The uncertainty clung to her like a shadow. Today was the day that everything would either change for the better or end in a bitter farewell. Georgia tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on what she could control: breakfast. She had prepared a meal that was unlike any other she'd made in the last week, an elaborate spread of her mother's recipes combined with her own love and care. Every dish was perfection: golden scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, light as air pancakes drizzled with fresh maple syrup, and homemade jam spread over freshly baked bread. She set the table with delicate wildflowers from the field, candles flickering softly in the early morning light, and even the smallest details felt like a message. This was her home now. As she placed the last dish on the table, her hands trembled, but she steadied herself. She had done everything she could. Now, all she could do was wait. Dustin came down the stairs a few moments later, his movements deliberate, his expression as unreadable as ever. He was dressed neatly for the first time in days, his hair combed, his face clean-shaven. The sight of him made her heart skip a beat, but she pushed the feeling down. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her. Not today. He walked into the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the table she had set. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in his gaze, surprise, maybe, or even admiration, but quickly vanished behind the usual mask of reserve. He sat at the table without a word, and Georgia served him his breakfast, her heart pounding in her chest. The air between them felt thick, loaded with unspoken words. Every bite he took seemed to carry a weight, and every time he glanced up at her, it felt like he was measuring her somehow. The silence between them was deafening, yet neither of them seemed willing to break it. The meal stretched on, each moment more agonizing than the last. When the food was gone and the table cleared, Dustin finally pushed his plate aside. He didn't look at her right away, his eyes fixed on the paper he had placed beside him on the table. The silence stretched between them, suffocating in its intensity. Then, with a deep breath, he slid the folded paper toward her. 7 days are up, he said, his voice quiet but firm. George's stomach plummeted. She could feel her breath catch in her throat as she reached for the paper. The weight of it seemed unbearable in her hands. She unfolded it slowly, her heart racing as she looked down at the words on the page. It wasn't the simple dismissal she had feared, but it was no less startling. It was a new contract, but this one wasn't for a cook. The words jumped off the page, and her eyes locked on them. Not for a cook, for a wife. If you'll have me. The words echoed in her ears, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her fingers shook as she lifted her gaze to him. Dustin was watching her closely, his face unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her heart race. He hadn't just offered her a place in his home, a job to keep the house in order. He was offering her something she had never dared hope for, a real place in his life. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, the weight of the paper between them too heavy to ignore. But before she could respond, Dustin stood up, walked around the table, and knelt before her, his movements slow but deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt her heart leap in her chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. As he unwrapped it, she saw the simple gold ring inside, the one that had belonged to his late wife, Sarah. He held it out to her, his eyes never leaving hers. Sarah would want someone to wear this who would love this home, he said quietly. And you do. You've brought it back to life. His words sank into her, wrapping around her like a blanket of warmth. The ring in his hand seemed to glow in the dim morning light, and for a moment, everything else faded away. This wasn't just a proposal. This was a promise, one that went beyond the contract, beyond the week they had spent together. He wasn't asking her to stay because he felt obligated. He was asking her to stay because he wanted her. I'm not asking because you have nowhere else to go, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I'm asking because I don't want to live anywhere you aren't. George's heart slammed in her chest. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back, unwilling to break down in front of him. This was what she had wanted, hadn't it? This was the moment she had dreamed of. This was the choice she had longed for. And yet, her mind swirled with doubt. Was this real? Was it truly happening? Or was it all just a dream? Marry me, Georgia Whitlow, Dustin said, his voice rough but filled with certainty. Choose me back. For a long moment, she didn't know how to respond. Her emotions were a tangled mess, but in the end, there was only one answer that made sense. Yes, she whispered, the words slipping from her lips as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Yes, Dustin. Yes. He stood up, pulling her in his arms, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what this meant. The promise of something real, something lasting, something more than she had ever thought she deserved. But just as quickly, the moment was interrupted by a loud, urgent pounding on the door. They both froze, and Dustin's face shifted into a mask of concern. "Dustin McCabe, trouble in town," a voice shouted from outside. Without another word, he pulled away from her, rushing to the door. "I'll be there within the hour," he called out, and then turned to Georgia, his eyes dark with concern. "Stay here. I'll handle this." But Georgia's heart was already racing again, fear bubbling in her chest. She couldn't stay hidden away while the world outside came crashing down. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the trembling in her hands. "This is my fight too. I won't hide anymore." Dustin's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, she saw pride in his eyes. "Then we ride together," he said. And with that, their journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The ride into town was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Georgia's heart was pounding in her chest as she sat on her horse beside Dustin, her grip tight on the reins, her mind a whirl of uncertainty. It wasn't the town she was worried about. It was the public confrontation, the moment when everything would be laid bare. Willow had arrived. She had come to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers, and Georgia had no idea how this would play out. The town had already judged her, the whispers and rumors swirling like dust around her every move. She could already hear their voices in her head, the cruel remarks, the comparisons to her beautiful sister, the constant reminder that she was just the second choice. She wasn't the one Dustin had wanted. She was just the one left behind when the better option had fallen through. Willow had come to take her place, to undo whatever progress Georgia had made in this last week. The pressure was suffocating. Georgia had thought that this day of choice, would be about her, about Dustin making the decision to keep her or send her away. But now, with Willow standing in the center of town, it was more than just about that. It was about her worth, about what she had fought for, about proving that she could stand tall even when the world was against her. The town square was bustling with people, all gathered in front of the mercantile, eyes trained on the two women who would soon face off. As soon as Georgia and Dustin arrived, the crowd fell silent, their gazes shifting from one to the other. Willow stood in the center, her beauty on full display, her posture perfect, her smile cool and practiced as she surveyed the scene. The moment their eyes met, Georgia could feel the weight of her sister's gaze, sharp and calculating. Willow's lips curved into a cruel smile. "Dustin McCabe," she called, her voice smooth and full of authority. "I've come to fulfill our agreement. You made a promise to my father. You hire me. I'll come to collect what's mine." She held up the original contract, the one her father had forged, the one that had brought Georgia here in the first place. The crowd murmured, their attention shifting to the document. Maeve Talcott and a few of the other women were standing nearby, watching with interest. Willow's supporters were already rallying behind her, casting sideways glances at Georgia, judging her with a look that spoke volumes. "My sister deceived you," Willow continued, her voice dripping with venom. "She's nothing like me. You were expecting a wife, someone beautiful, someone capable. And instead, you got her." She pointed directly at Georgia, her finger like a blade. "She took my place, took what was meant for me." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the tension rising with every word. Georgia's stomach turned, and for a moment, she wanted to shrink back, to hide, to become invisible as she had always done. It would be so easy to let them see her as the ugly duckling, the one who didn't deserve to be standing there, the one who wasn't good enough. But something inside her shifted, and for the first time in her life, she refused to cower. She straightened her back, lifting her chin as she stepped forward. The town was watching her now, judging her in ways she couldn't control. If she could control how she stood, she wouldn't be the mistake anymore. "Willow is right about one thing," Georgia said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "I'm not the woman he hired. I never was." She turned to face Dustin, her heart pounding as she looked into his eyes. "But what I've done here, what I've brought to this house, It's not about what was promised. It's about what's real. It's about what we have, what we've built together in just a week. And that's worth more than any contract. She could feel the weight of the town's gaze on her, but she didn't back down. Willow's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering for a moment as she saw the fire in Georgia's eyes. She had always thought of Georgia as weak, as the one who would always fade in the background. But now, Georgia was standing strong. You think a week of cooking and cleaning can make up for everything? Willow sneered. You think you've earned your place here? Her voice dripped with scorn. What kind of woman do you think I am? I think you're a woman who doesn't see what's right in front of her. Georgia shot back. You spent your whole life believing that beauty and wealth are the only things that matter. But there's more to life than that. There's something deeper, something that sticks. Her words hit like a punch, and for a moment, Willow's perfect facade cracked. She straightened, her lips tight with fury. You're nothing but a substitute, she hissed before turning to the crowd. Look at her. She doesn't belong here. She's not even close to the woman Dustin promised. You all know it. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but it was Maeve Talcott who spoke next, her voice loud and full of conviction. A man deserves what he paid for, Maeve said, her eyes flashing as she glared at Georgia. He hired beauty and talent, and he got neither. The crowd muttered in agreement, and Georgia could feel herself begin to retreat, to shrink back into the shadows where she had always lived. The whispers, the judgments, they were all too familiar. But then Dustin's voice cut through the noise, firm and commanding. You're all wrong, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, silencing the murmurs. His eyes locked onto Willow's, then shifted to the townspeople. Yes, Willow is beautiful. There's no denying that. But beauty doesn't make a house a home. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving George's face. Beauty doesn't fill the silence. It doesn't heal wounds, and it doesn't bring life back to a place that's been hollow for too long. The words were like a balm to George's bruised soul, and for the first time, she felt like the walls between them had been torn down completely. Georgia has done more in these last 7 days than I ever expected, Dustin continued, his voice growing stronger. She's filled this house with more than just food. She's made it alive again. And I'm not just talking about the meals. I'm talking about the way she's made me feel, like I'm worth something again. He turned to face Georgia, his eyes soft but steady. I asked you to stay because you're the woman I want. You're the woman I choose. The crowd was silent now, and for a moment, Georgia thought she might fall apart. But instead, she felt a rush of warmth spread through her, her heart racing with a mix of wonder and relief. Dustin stepped forward again, pulling her hand into his, and as he held it up for everyone to see, the gold ring glinted in the sunlight. I gave her that ring this morning, he said, because I want her here. I chose her. The shock rippled through the crowd, and for a moment, there was silence, a stunned pause. But then, from the back of the crowd, a few women started to clap, the sound soft at first, then louder as more joined in. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, the tension easing. Willow's face twisted in humiliation, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. She turned sharply, storming off, her supporters trailing behind her. As she disappeared into the distance, Georgia felt a weight lift off her chest. The battle was over. Dustin had chosen her. 2 weeks later, in the warmth of their home, they were married in a quiet, simple ceremony. The sheriff officiated. A few of Dustin's ranch hands were there, and some of the town's women, those who had come to respect Georgia for the woman she had become, joined them. Georgia wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant, but she had never felt more radiant. Their vows were raw, honest, and full of the promise they had made to each other. Dustin promised to always choose her, to see her for who she truly was, not just as the woman he had expected, but as the woman he had come to love. Georgia promised to always choose him, to feed him, to make their home worth coming back to. The reception was small but full of joy, as Georgia cooked the wedding feast herself, just as she had cooked every meal in the days leading up to this moment. Dustin helped, his hands brushing hers as they worked side by side. He stole bites of food when she wasn't looking, and she swatted his hand away with a smile. Their laughter filled the house, a sound that had been missing for so long. Later that night, as the last of the guests left, Dustin and Georgia stood in their kitchen, alone. He pulled her into his arms, his lips brushing her forehead as he whispered, "Best decision I ever made, giving you 7 days." She smiled up at him, her heart full. "You mean telling me to leave at dawn?" she teased. He kissed her then, soft and slow, as if he never wanted to let her go. "I was an idiot. Good thing you didn't listen." They danced together in the kitchen, their feet shuffling to no music, lost in the quiet rhythm of their love. Tomorrow, they would cook breakfast together, as they always would from now on. But tonight, they were just two souls who had finally found each other. As Georgia lay in his arms, she thought back to the words Dustin had said, to the promise he had made, "I choose you." And for the first time in her life, Georgia Whitlow knew she had been chosen. She had been seen.